The sun is going out over London. It's the middle of the afternoon, and the sky's going dark anyway. Not clouds, not a storm. Something is sliding across the sun, and the light drains out of the city street by street. Stand in that street for a second. The birds go quiet. The temperature drops. You look up like everyone else, and in March of 1485, nobody around you can say for certain when the light is coming back. Inside the Palace of Westminster, under that dying light, a queen is dying too. And within 2 weeks, the King of England will stand up in front of the city and swear he had nothing to do with it. Which is exactly the kind of thing a man says when everyone already thinks he did. Her name is Anne Neville. She is 28 years old. And the rumour that starts the day she dies, the rumour about how she died, is going to outlive her by 500 years. Long after the truth gets written down. Long after anyone could check it. This is the 16th of March, 1485. And here's the strange part. Almost everything, the famous version of her death, gets wrong. It gets wrong in the same direction. Against the same man. We're going to do something simple with this one. We're going to take the records from that spring in the order they were actually written, a king's own words, set down by men who stood in the room, before anyone knew which version of the story was going to win. This is a story about how history gets written, and how a piece of it got written wrong for 500 years. Because there are 3 knots in this story, and we'll untie all of them. Why an ordinary death became the most famous suspected murder of its age. Why the one man with an obvious motive walked into a hall full of Londoners and denied it and made it worse. And why the historian, who first wrote that he poisoned her, had, 2 years earlier, written something about this woman he'd have given anything to take back. The motive everyone believed in lives in one place, the size of her inheritance, so follow the money first. Anne Neville was the younger daughter of Richard Neville, Earl of Warwick, the man they called the Kingmaker. For 20 years, Warwick was the closest thing England had to a person who could pick its kings. He raised one up, then tore him down to raise another. And when he was killed at the Battle of Barnet in 1471, he left no sons. He left 2 daughters and one of the largest fortunes in the country, estates scattered across more than 20 counties. Enough land that you could ride for days and never leave it. Anne was half of it. A girl worth that much did not get to decide much. Watch how fast her life gets spent. In 1 month in the spring of 1471, Anne loses her father at Barnet and her first husband, the Lancastrian Prince of Wales, weeks later at the Battle of Tewkesbury. She is 15. She has already been married into one royal dynasty and widowed out of another. And now she is the single most valuable, unmarried woman in England. What happens to her next is the reason the whole murder rumour was so easy to believe 13 years later. And it has nothing to do with poison. It has to do with a kitchen. Anne had an older sister, Isabel. Isabel was married to George, Duke of Clarence, another royal brother. And Clarence had done the maths on Warwick's estate. If his sister-in-law Anne stayed unmarried, or married quietly, the entire fortune could flow through Isabel, to him. He'd become the richest man in England, outside the king himself. One thing stood in the way. His own brother Richard wanted to marry Anne, and a marriage to Anne meant splitting that fortune down the middle. So Clarence made the problem disappear. According to the Chronicler, a contemporary source, not a legend, Clarence took the Kingmaker's daughter, a girl who'd been Princess of Wales months earlier, and hid her in the City of London. Disguised as a kitchen maid, a cook, he dressed a future queen in a servant's apron and tucked her away among the pots so his brother couldn't find her and claim half the land. Richard found her anyway. The Chronicler says, almost with admiration, that he was the more cunning of the two. He tracked her down and moved her into sanctuary, out of his brother's reach. And the dramas love this part because it looks like a rescue. A man saving the woman he loves. Maybe it was, but notice what nobody in the story is doing. Nobody is asking Anne. Two royal brothers spent months fighting over where a woman should be hidden, and neither fight was about her. Both were about her land. Hold on to that, because it's the whole pattern. To the men around her, Anne was never quite a person. She was an asset other people needed to control. So when she dies 13 years later, and someone suggests a husband killed her to free up a better marriage, the country doesn't even blink. It had watched men treat her exactly that way her whole life. Murder was just the next logical step in a story that had never once been about what she wanted. So the man she marries, once Clarence loses the fight, is Richard. The brother of the king her own family died trying to destroy, but marrying her isn't simple either. First, the brothers fight over Warwick's land, goes all the way to the king. Edward IV has to step in and personally carve the dead earl's fortune in two. And then the marriage itself needs paperwork from the other side of Europe. Because Anne's dead first husband had been Richard's cousin, the match falls inside the forbidden degrees of kinship under church law. It isn't legal until a dispensation comes back from Pope Sixtus IV in Rome. Picture the signatures it took to marry one woman, two royal brothers, an English king, and the Pope himself. The only consent nobody bothered to record was hers. But here's the thing about that fortune. There was a problem with whose it actually was. It belonged by right to Anne's mother. The Countess of Warwick was still alive, and the land was legally hers. So Edward IV and Parliament solved that the way powerful men solve inconvenient women. They passed an act declaring her legally dead. Not actually dead, she was very much alive, just dead on paper, so her property could pass to her daughters, and through them to the king's brothers. And the Countess did the one thing the system never expected. She fought back. From sanctuary, she wrote letters. To the king, to the lords, to the powerful women around the court, demanding her rights, refusing to disappear quietly. We still have the record of how well it worked, because it worked well enough that Edward IV gave a direct order to stop her from writing. A woman with a pen, declared dead by an act of Parliament, scared the King of England enough that he had to silence her on paper too. If a government declaring an inconvenient person legally dead to seize their estate sounds like something only a medieval court would do, it has a modern name. We call it civil death, and versions of it still exist, but it works. In 1472 they marry, Anne and Richard, Duke of Gloucester. 11 years later, he takes the throne as Richard III, and on the 6th of July, 1483, Anne Neville is crowned Queen of England in Westminster Abbey. Everything her father died chasing, hers at last. She'll hold it for less than 2 years. Here's the thing a crown was actually for, passing it on, and Anne and Richard had exactly one person to pass it to, a son, Edward of Middleham, named for the Yorkshire castle where Anne had grown up, and where Richard had grown up too. One boy, one fragile life, holding the entire future of the dynasty. In April 1484, Richard and Anne are at Nottingham Castle when the messenger reaches them. Imagine that moment, a rider comes in hard, and before he speaks you already know, because no one rides like that with good news. Their son is dead. He died on the 9th of April at Middleham, the castle where both his parents had once been children themselves. He was around 10 years old. The cause then and now is unknown. The Crowland Chronicler, writing close to the court within a few years of all this, describes the parents' reaction in one unforgettable line. You might have seen the father and mother, he writes, in a state almost bordering on madness, by reason of their sudden grief. We don't know exactly what killed the boy. What we know is the shape of what's left behind. A king with a crown, and no heir, and a queen who has now buried her father, her first husband, her sister, and her only child. She isn't 30 yet. By Christmas, she's ill. And it's a single line about that illness, written by the same chronicler, that turns a grieving husband into a murderer. Here's the line. As Anne lay dying, the chronicler writes, the king, entirely shunned her bed. And he adds, pointedly, that Richard said the doctors had told him to. The Chronicler clearly doesn't buy it. He writes it the way you write something you want the reader to suspect. Read it cold, its medical sense, a dying queen, a disease everyone's terrified is catching, physicians telling a king to keep his distance. Read it the Chronicler's way, it's a confession with the volume turned down, a husband backing away from a wife who's no longer any use to him. One sentence, both a tragedy and a motive. The reader gets to pick. And by early 1485, the country is ready to pick the dark one. Because there's no second son, the dynasty has no heir. And across the channel, an exile named Henry Tudor is building an invasion. And he's sworn, in public, to marry Elizabeth of York and fuse the two warring houses through their children. Elizabeth of York is the prize that ends the war. Whoever marries her holds the better claim to peace, and Richard can see exactly one way to take her off the board before Henry Tudor gets there. Marry her himself. One obstacle. He already has a wife, and right on cue that wife starts to die. Lay it out the way Richard's enemies did, and the case writes itself. A king who needs a new wife, a queen in the way, a husband who's stopped sharing her bed and blamed the doctors, a rival across the sea, racing for the same bride. She's dead within weeks of the whispers starting, and on the day she dies, the sun goes out, over England. The story moves fast and it moves through people who already hate him. They say the king poisoned her. They say he complained at court that she was barren. They say he floated the new marriage to his advisors while his wife was still breathing in the next room. And then the detail that should close it. One of the men who later wrote, flatly, that Richard poisoned Anne wasn't some foreign gossip. He was an English antiquary named John Rous, who had known the Neville family in person, someone who'd stood in the same rooms as them. A motive, a convenient death, a husband pulling away, a rival bride, a man who knew the family, writing it down as fact. By every standard a medieval court would recognise, the case against Richard III is closed, except almost none of it survives contact with the record. Start with the man who supposedly couldn't wait for her to die. Historians have reconstructed, almost day by day, where Richard was that winter, from the surviving records of his reign. From the moment Anne falls ill just after Christmas until she dies in March, the king barely leaves the palace of Westminster, where she's lying. Across nearly 3 months, he's gone a total of about 11 days. That's not a man counting down to a funeral so he can remarry. That's a man who stayed in the building. Then there's the poison, and here's the problem. There is no contemporary account of any poisoning. None. What the sources describe across her last months is a slow wasting decline. Fever, breathlessness, exhaustion, a body coughing itself away. To modern eyes, that's the unmistakable handwriting of tuberculosis. We will never have a diagnosis across 5 centuries, but we have symptoms, and they don't point to a cup. They point to a sickbed, and the eclipse, the sign from heaven, the dark sky that supposedly proved God had turned his back on a murderer. Go back to the chronicle that recorded it. It notes plainly that the Queen died on the day of a great eclipse of the sun, and was buried with the honours of a queen. That's the entry. It doesn't build a case out of the sky. The omen reading, God turning his back on a doomed king, is something later writers layered on top, working backward from the fact that Richard would be dead within 5 months. To the people actually alive that afternoon, an eclipse was terrifying, yes, but it didn't name a murderer. The verdict came later, which brings us to the strangest scene in the whole thing, the one that kept the rumour alive for centuries. The 30th of March, 1485, 2 weeks after Anne's death. Richard III walks into the Great Hall at Clerkenwell in front of the Mayor of London, his lords, and a crowd of ordinary citizens. And the King of England stands up to talk about his marriage. The record's still there, in the books of the Mercers' Company of London. Speaking, by the record's own description. In a clear and loud voice, Richard declares that it had never entered his mind to marry his niece, and that he was not glad of his queen's death, but, in the words set down, as sorry as a man might be. Look at what a public denial actually does, not as a feeling, as a mechanism. A king does not gather the city of London to deny a rumour nobody's allowed to repeat. He does it because the rumour is already everywhere, and a denial, by its nature, broadcasts the exact thing it denies. Every single person who walked out of that hall went home knowing precisely what their king had felt the need to swear, out loud, that he had not done. And here's the part that turns it from a mistake into a tragedy. According to the Chronicler, Richard didn't even want to give the speech. His own counsellors, Catesby and Ratcliffe, pushed him into it. They'd run the politics. A marriage to his niece would never clear the church, and it would cost him the loyalty of the North, where Anne had been loved as the Kingmaker's daughter. The denial wasn't a husband clearing his name. It was damage control by frightened advisors. And it failed. Now go back one last time to John Rous, the man who knew the Nevilles, the man who wrote that Richard poisoned Anne. Because Rous wrote about Anne Neville twice, and the two things he wrote don't match at all. While Richard was alive and on the throne, Rous made a roll, an illustrated family history, and in it, Anne is gracious, beautiful, good. He praises her. He praises the king who married her. It's the work of an admirer. Then Bosworth, Richard dies on the field in August 1485, the last English king to fall in battle. A new dynasty takes the throne, Henry Tudor's. And John Rous sits down and writes a second history of England. In this one, Richard is a monster. In this one, he poisoned his queen. Same antiquary, same lifetime. Two opposite verdicts on the same woman's death. Nothing new had turned up in between. No evidence surfaced, no witness came forward. The only thing that changed was which royal family it was now safe and profitable to flatter. The truth about how Anne Neville died didn't evolve. The politics around it did. We think of this as a medieval problem, but it's the most modern thing in the story. A regime falls, and overnight, the official record of the people in it gets rewritten by whoever won. The same figure called gracious one year, and a monster the next, with no new facts in between, just a new government deciding which version is now the approved one. We've watched it happen to public reputations inside our own lifetimes. Rous just did it with a pen and a sheet of vellum. That's how a rumour outlives a fact, not because anyone proved it, because the winners liked it better. And the winners had a long reach, because the version of Anne most people carry around today didn't come from Rous, or from any chronicle. It came from a playwright, 100 years later. In Shakespeare's Richard III, Anne barely exists as a person. She gets one famous scene, Richard courting her over the coffin of a man he helped kill. And then she's gone, poisoned off stage so he can marry Elizabeth of York, a footnote to his villainy. The play is brilliant. It is also written under the granddaughter of Henry Tudor, for an audience that needed the last Plantagenet king to be a monster. Shakespeare didn't invent the slander. He took it from the Tudor chroniclers, mainly Holinshed, who'd taken it from men like Rous. He polished it and made it permanent. Most people who think they know how Anne Neville died are really remembering a stage direction, so the real woman keeps getting smaller. The Kingmaker's daughter, twice tied to the throne, becomes a single scene in someone else's play. The poisoning that never happened becomes the only thing she's famous for. And the records that could correct all of it sit in archives, accurate and ignored, for 4 centuries. Anne Neville was buried in Westminster Abbey on the 25th of March, 1485, with, in the chronicler's words, honours fit for a queen. And then nothing went on her grave. No stone, no name, no effigy, nothing to tell you the woman under the floor had ever worn a crown. 5 months later, Richard was dead at Bosworth, and there was no one left with a reason, or the safety, to mark where his wife lay. The Kingmaker's daughter, twice tied to the throne of England, crowned in that abbey, just disappeared into the floor of it. For 475 years, there was nothing there to say she'd ever existed. Then in 1960, a society devoted to Richard III fixed a small brass plaque to the abbey wall, as close to her unmarked grave as anyone could get. The words on it aren't theirs. They're taken from the Rous roll, from the version Rous wrote while she was still alive, before it got convenient to write something crueler. The kind version. The first one. The true one. So here's where the two stories land. The rumour says a king murdered a queen to clear his path to a crown. The record says a grieving man stayed inside a dying woman's palace, lost his throne and his life inside a year, and was buried with even less ceremony than she got. Did Richard want a new wife? Almost certainly. Was he capable of cold things to keep his throne? The age was full of them, and so was he. But wanting and doing aren't the same act, and on the one question of whether he poisoned Neville, the evidence isn't thin. It's missing. There's no body of proof to weigh. There's only a story everyone preferred. We like to think the truth wins in the end, that if you just wait long enough, the facts come up and the lie burns off. Neville is the case that should make you less sure. The facts about her death were written down at the time, by the people who were there. They were sitting in the record the whole way through, and for 500 years, they lost, quietly, completely, to a better story. The eclipse passed in an hour. The shadow they blamed it for took 500 years to lift.